Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 18. This week I'm excited to bring you a conversation I had with Aline Smithson, who, for those of us in the photography community, she needs no introduction, but if you're perhaps a little less familiar with the world of fine art photography, let me just say that Aline is a hugely influential figure in the photo world, and I'm very proud to count her as one of my friends. In addition to being an outstanding photographer in her own right, Aline is well known as the founder and editor of the popular website Lenscratch, which has been named one of the top 10 photo blogs in the world by Source Review, Wired.com, Rangefinder, and InStyle magazine. She's also a photo educator, and she's taught workshops at the LA Center for Photography, the Main Media Workshops, and the Santa Fe Workshops, as well as many other places. And on top of all that, she is a regular guest lecturer at all manner of photo festivals. She regularly participates as a portfolio reviewer and an exhibition juror. She is, as they say, non-stop. So late last year, Aline released a new book with the Magenta Foundation called Self and Others, Portrait as Autobiography. And I was pleased to get to talk with her about it during our conversation, which you'll hear that in a minute. This book spans almost 20 years worth of photographs from her early black and white work that begins, as many of us begin, with a focus on the everyday and especially her children. And then it moves through several series of hand-painted photographs and then into her more recent color work, including two series called Hollywood at Home and Revisiting Beauty, which we referenced a few times in the conversation. All the way through the book, what you can see is that although Aline's lens is always turned outward, she's intimately present in all of the images, which is what that title talks about. I'm happy to say that I own a copy of this book, and although the trade edition has now sold out, as I'm recording this episode, there are still copies of the special edition available. I would encourage you to check out her website, which I've linked in the show notes, and if you have an opportunity to get a look at this book, definitely take it. It is just fantastic. And, I could go on and on, but let's just jump in, shall we? Here's my conversation with Aline Smithson. Yeah, it's funny. I get a lot of people, saying, gosh, you must be so busy all the time. And I often think about you, like you are probably one of the busiest people, if not possibly the busiest person that I know. You always have so much going on. I was just a few minutes ago, looking over your website again, and I wrote this down. So you had, last year, you had 3 solo shows and 8 group shows last year. You had 4 solo shows scheduled for this year. 3 solo shows and 8 group shows last year. 4 solo shows scheduled for this year. 8 group shows last year. And you already have a solo show scheduled for next year as well. On top of that, you have stuff on Lenscratch 7 days a week. And you are... it seems like you're always somewhere else too, like going to a festival, attending a festival, being on a panel. I mean, how do you find the time for it all?
It was, a lot of this has happened because I have the book. I had a book come out last year, and so in some way things are slowing down a bit. So I literally did travel every week in April to a different location. And I traveled all fall. I think every 2 weeks I was on a plane. So because of that, I have turned down almost every invitation I got this year. Mm-hmm. So I also feel like I am kind of sick of me. And I want to retreat back into the original state of being a photographer for a while, and just take a break. I mean, there is no break because I'm teaching and I am doing various things, but and I've been asked to teach a lot of a lot of workshops next year in different locations. So. it is sort of nonstop, and as my husband will attest, I do work 7 days a week. But I'm really, really working hard to carve out at least mental time to think about what's next and what kind of work I want to make. And because I didn't get in this to do everything but be a photographer. So, I will not be as much, the travel won't be quite as much, though it's still pretty bad this fall. So,
I've just always been so impressed because it seems like, you're able to maintain your own practice. You're pretty prolific shooter, it seems like, but on top of that, you do so many things for other people in this community. It's just really impressive.
Well, thank you. I wish I was a little more prolific this year. I did, it's really interesting in terms of the journey of a creative person. I don't think you can be creative all the time. I think life gets in the way. I think there are things that sort of throw you off course. And certainly having a book come out, and I really felt like I needed to honor that. Excuse me. And I really needed to pay attention to that journey. So I gave myself permission not to worry about making work for about a year. And that sort of took some of the burden of that feeling that you're not being creative off. So, but I did try to, there was areas that I could try to be creative in, for instance, when I had to create my Kickstarter video for the book, to raise money for the book, at first I thought about it with a lot of dread. And then I thought, this is just another opportunity to be creative. And why not sort of shift the way I think about it and really have fun with it? So, there have been moments that I have been able to do some things that are fun and creative. So,
yeah. I mean, and it's also one of those things too, where having sometimes, even if you're busy with other things, that having a little time away from the making of the things can sort of recharge you and get you going once you're ready to do that again.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that book that you mentioned, I have a copy myself. I actually just noticed last night that my name is in the back of it, since you named all of your Kickstarter backers, and I was pleasantly surprised about that. But I was just going through it again, and it's just a magnificent book.
I have to agree. I'm not talking about the content. I'm really talking about the design. I was so thrilled to work with the Magenta Foundation and work with their incredible, the Gilbert Lee, who it's his design house that designed the book. And I'm also thrilled with the special edition, which really reflects a lot about my sensibility, what they did. It's kind of an orange lacquer case that you pull out, and there's a leopard skin book. And I just sort of love that surprise. But I do think they did just a beautiful job in all the details that surround the work, and I couldn't be more thrilled to have that book.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and it's quite a, you're being very modest about the content of the book, but I mean, looking through it, it's interesting to see the progression of your work through the years, starting from the early family-oriented black and white stuff through the more recent color work, and you can see a definite development in your eye as a photographer, but also, like, even the earliest pictures in there are still very recognizably you.
Yeah, and there's part of me that wants to go back in time and just make those simple photos that are just about my life. And unfortunately, I don't have small children to photograph at home anymore, so that is harder. But I I actually, when I look at it, I can see growth too, but I also can see sort of the constraints of the photo world about how we make work and the idea of projects and how things become more and more sort of defined. And that sort of makes me yearn for the early part of that book where I was just simply really just enjoying being a photographer and shooting things with nothing else in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Everybody sort of has their own way of working, definitely. I've certainly heard a lot of people talking about sort of pushing back on the idea that we have to work in projects. There was this article that Blake Andrews wrote. This would have probably been 5 or 6 years ago at this point, and he was talking about how he calls his approach the photography integrated into life approach. Mm-hmm. And or for shorthand, he calls it the shoot first, ask questions later method. That is for me. It's a lot. You've seen my work. It's a lot closer to how I operate. But I've also always been so impressed by people who can do things that I can't do. And
right.
and being able to really construct an image and to really sort of be able to see something in your mind ahead of time, as a studio photographer must be able to do, to be able to construct it from the ground up.
Right.
That is definitely a skill, and it's impressive,
Oh yeah, and the other thing I was thinking about that idea of just shooting and sort of thinking about it later is that eliminates sort of the idea of really creating work with intention. And I'm sure there's intention because, for instance, your work is a lot about family, and so you know what your intention is. But I think when people are really trying to make work about a specific idea or concept, or they want to bring light to an issue, that they're not going to be able to shoot first and think later. They really have to think about what they need to shoot. Mm-hmm. So there's just all different kinds of ways of working, and it's kind of interesting to think about trying on some of those ways that are not comfortable to you, mm-hmm. that sort of challenges you as an image maker. And sometimes I think about going out and trying to make sort of a documentary project or something that is sort of beyond what I'm comfortable doing, just to challenge myself. And unfortunately, I haven't had the time to do that, but it's still sort of percolating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I find that oftentimes when I try to branch out, I still end up ultimately returning back to the methods that I'm comfortable with, but that when I do so, it often, the new experience of trying to work in a different way brings some new facet to my older methods, my more comfortable methods that allow me to branch out in new ways. Mm-hmm. I think it can be a very valuable educational experience just to...
Right,
yeah.
Right.
Now, looking through this, I was, like I said last night, I spent a good couple hours just sort of poring over your book again, and it's interesting because one of the things that I realized is that the first actual series of yours, the first photographs of yours that I can recall seeing are not in that book. The first time I ever saw, I was aware of you as a publisher for a long time before I ever saw your work or met you because of Lenscratch. So this would have been in 2012 at the first Medium Festival. Mm-hmm. And you gave a presentation, you were doing portfolio reviews, and then they did a portfolio walk for the presenters there, and you were showing work from your Lonesome Doll series, was the first of yours that I'd ever seen. And so that's always kind of stuck in my mind as my first impression of you.
Well, I wonder what that impression was.
It's and it's funny too because and then since that work isn't in the book, I went back and searched for it on your website, and so that series is you're staging these scenes with this sort of creepy looking doll, but one of the things that I remember at the time, and it really struck me again, is is how when you look at these pictures, they're initially a little unsettling, just because dolls having a sort of fixed visage can be a little unsettling, but that as you move through the pictures, you eventually come away with this sense of empathy for this figure, and that strikes me as something that's very it's continuous throughout your work.
Well, that's interesting. The reason that's not in the book is that when the Magenta Foundation approached me, they said, we want to do a retrospective book of your work. And my first reaction was, I really don't want to give you everything. Mm-hmm. I want there to be other books. I don't want this all to be wrapped up in a bow. And then I also thought, I work in so many different ways that the one thing that has been consistent throughout my work is making portraiture, though I literally have never thought of myself as a portrait photographer. Mm-hmm. So I kept out a number of projects that I didn't feel fit with the book. And I've also created a book called The Lonesome Doll, and it's for children and adult children. And it has a story, and it is about learning to love yourself, and I think it's really a powerful book. I've given it in MegCloud form to a few of my friends that have kids, and a friend of mine in Seattle said that her son actually created a little tattoo for his arm of the book, and he made the kindergarten teacher read it and reread it, and so I just haven't found a publisher yet. I've gotten very close with a few, but I really, to me, that work speaks so much to me of really looking at, as you say, being a very empathetic person, and I hope that finds a home one day, because in some ways that project means more to me than almost any of my projects. Mm.
Yeah, there's this definite feeling of sort of pathos or melancholy to that series.
Definitely.
But mixed in with it is this sense of playfulness as well.
Yeah, I think I really tapped into, we all have those moments in our growing up where you don't feel like you quite fit in and you feel left out, and I think I really tapped into a lot of my childhood feelings that I think everybody has. I did really fall in love with this doll, and I have 3 of them, and I often bring them with me wherever I go so I can have the opportunity to shoot at least one. And I always worry that one day when I'm going through the TSA, that they're going to open my bag and see these bizarre dolls and keep me back. But
so far, I guess that hasn't happened yet. That's good. But I mean, and it's a thing. When I look at all of these portraits that are in this book, this beautiful book of yours, there was one of your essays that you included, sort of a artist statement. There's a separate artist statement for each section of the book, and in one of them, you talked about how you are taking these pictures of other people, initially of your family, but that really the photographs are about you, and that seems to be obvious, even with the title of the book, Self and Others, that you building portraits and understanding portraits in a way as a reflection of the photographer herself, and that I think is a really interesting concept.
Well, I think as photographers, we are all just creating self-portraits in a sense. Whatever we shoot, whatever we decide to frame, the subject matter that we select, all reflects something about ourselves. And I felt, especially with this portrait work, and for me, for instance, Hollywood at Home and Revisiting Beauty, some of my later series, really reflect the things that I have been drawn to. I love old Hollywood portraits done sort of in the 40s and 50s, the glamour shots, the Technicolor color palette. And then I came out of painting. I went to art school and I was a painter, and I've, always loved painting. And so I felt like that project, Revisiting Beauty, really spoke to my background as a painter. And so even when I'm photographing the person, I know exactly what I want them, their pose and their sensibility to be. And I often find myself creating the pose within myself as sort of a reflection for them to understand what I'm looking for. So I'm really projecting myself into that shoot. And then of course in your editing decisions, you're also choosing what most reflects your sensibility rather than the person. So, and I tend to only work with people I know. I've never used a model. And I think that intimacy also speaks to me in my life, so that I'm not working with anything foreign and creating something out of it. I'm really working with things that are very close to home.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if that completely answers your question, but.
No, it does. And, I think with those, particularly those two later series that you mentioned, Revisiting Beauty and Hollywood at Home, there is such a, I want to say reverence or tenderness maybe in the photographs. And I think that really speaks to that familiarity that you have with the people that you're using as subjects.
Right. I truly love everyone I photograph, even if I don't know them well. I think I wrote in another part of the book that when you photograph someone, they're there. I shoot very quickly. So, sometimes they're in and out in 15 minutes. And then I take those negatives and spend years with them, looking at that person and falling in love with them. And of course, the person that has sat for me has no idea how much they have imprinted on my psyche. So I think that I do have, and especially the Rolleiflex, there is something about that camera that I just think it has a gaze. It has a gaze more than any other camera I've ever used, and that gaze is just, I think there is some kind of emotion in that camera, and it comes out in the work.
Yeah, and there's definitely something to be said for finding the tools that really speak to you. And because I don't think very many people would say that anybody has to use a particular camera or lens or film or whatever, but that when you find that thing that really clicks with you, there's something kind of magical that happens.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. And since I don't shoot digital, I don't know if digital photographers have that same sort of aha moment that this is the camera for them.
I think so. I mean, I think it just depends. Some people, the tool at hand is not really important to what it is that they're doing, to their process. I mean, I know that there are people who just kind of, pick up one thing for one project, pick up then whatever's at hand for the next one, and that seems to work for them. Certainly for me, I work with, a lot of times I just work with whatever I have near me. But I think that a lot of that really comes down to yourself as the artist, finding the right tools for what you want to do for executing your vision can be a really important part of the process.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wish more of my students would try on film and see what that feels like. But I do understand that it's very different and it's expensive, and it's much easier to just be able to shoot and see what you're getting right away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, each thing has its sort of, I personally like the idea of, not that one or the other is better or worse, but just that they're different. They sort of force you to do different things, and acknowledging that the way that the tools influence the work, that, you know, you can still make meaningful work, whatever tools you choose, but that the tools do have an influence on the work, and on how you work, and on even the way that you see. So yeah, I mean, having that experience, at least to try things out, is always, you know, can only expand your horizons.
Right. Right.
Now, one of the things that I don't think this is still going on, but a thing that you were participating in for a good while was the 6-Shooters project. That was something that I had an immense amount of fun following you and your fellow photographer friends engaging in this photographic conversation. And I think that is such an interesting idea, of sort of having this visual conversation or visual chain that you had going. What was that experience like for you?
Well, it came about because I had been invited by this British collective, and I think they were called The Chain at the time. I don't think it's happening anymore. And they invited just a very few guest photographers. Martin Parr was one. I was one. But they didn't create work for it necessarily. You could use your own photograph, but you could use any image. And that was kind of, it was really interesting to me to see how that worked and to see sort of the level of looking. And I was out to lunch with a group of friends, and we were all talking about the fact that we work in isolation, and that wouldn't it be fun if we could figure out some kind of project so that we could be connected. And then I explained what this collective was doing, and said, why don't we do it with our own work? And the majority of us were film shooters, so we really had to just use our archives as the images that we used for the site. And because of that, it really made me make work differently, because whenever I was out, I would shoot something I normally would never shoot, like a pile of tires or a doorway or something that I wasn't normally making work for, but I never knew what kind of image I would have to respond to. Mm-hmm. So I really built a different archive for that project just for fun. And it was a really, really fun project. I loved following Ashley Stoll in the beginning, and then Bootsy Holler. And then after 3 years, a lot of us just got busy. Nancy Barron had a book come out, and my book was beginning production, and people were feeling like they just couldn't commit on a regular basis. And I have to say that I really miss it, and I wouldn't be unhappy if we started it up again. Mm-hmm. I know we've inspired a number of other groups of people are doing something exactly like what we were doing, but that's okay. Mm-hmm. And I just loved that process of connecting images. And I always looked forward to seeing what someone picked to follow someone else. And the best part was that we had a couple of exhibitions of the train of images. And I even saw things in the prints that I had missed seeing it on the screen, and it even made the connection stronger. And the people that came to the exhibitions really loved kind of that Where's Waldo idea of looking at the next image with great curiosity to see what they were inspired by from the image before. And that was really fun.
Yeah. I always sort of thought of it as kind of like a mixtape, you know, like when you used to make a mixtape and you're like, what should come next? What, you know, how does this one go into the next one? And thinking about that visually and seeing how each of you would respond, you know, might be a gesture, it might be a color, it might be composition, it might be, any a feeling. There are so many different connections and types of connections that you all, made between the different photographs. It was just really fun to watch it unfold.
And it was real for me. When I looked, I was always posting on Fridays, and when I saw the Thursday post, to me it was like Christmas. It was like, ooh, what can I follow with? And I'll never forget Bootsy Holler on her first day. She had an adult man in a corner in diapers eating birthday cake with a crown. And I thought, this is going to be a wild ride. What am I going to follow that with? But that's what made it so fun. So.
Yeah. And definitely having, being able to make those connections, those personal connections as well, or to reinforce connections that were already there. Having a community, an artistic community, is such an important thing, I think, for all of us. And like you were saying, especially, I think visual artists and writers are like this as well. Often that you work so much of your time on your own things, and that involves just working by yourself most of the time, can be very lonesome, very isolating. And finding ways to build or reinforce a community is such a valuable thing.
Yeah, and I've really noticed more and more photographers are doing collaborative projects, which I think is fantastic. And I certainly want to do some more down the road. And it's just, I think it sort of adds a little spark to your practice, because you're getting some influence from someone else, and it's nice to have some things that are just fun to do.
Yeah.
And we forget the benefit of joy and fun and creativity, because sometimes we begin to take ourselves a little too seriously.
Yeah.
At least I don't, but I think many people do.
Yeah. What you also, so much of your work on a day-to-day basis is building a larger community, a national, even international community, through what you do at Lenscratch, and also what you do, participating as a teacher, participating in portfolio reviews, giving lectures at different festivals. But I think a lot of people are able to connect with each other through that work that you do. I know that I have personally reached out to a lot of artists who I've seen on Lenscratch that I wouldn't have known of otherwise, and also the open exhibitions that you do on Lenscratch have been a way of connecting with people through those themed exhibitions. I'm personally, just very grateful that there are people like you who are doing that kind of work to build up this community. I think that it's just such a valuable thing. Well,
it has certainly enriched my life on many levels, just having the ability to look at so much work and to make meaningful connections with other photographers. And then, the best thing that happens is I feature someone on Lenscratch, and things happen for the person because of that. Mm-hmm. And that's always so exciting when the photographer writes me and says, I'm getting a show because the gallerist saw it on Lenscratch, or, it just makes me so happy.
I can imagine even just for me, seeing the variety of work that you publish on Lenscratch has really been enormously educational for me, and in figuring out things that I could do for my own practice. I can only imagine that must also be true for you.
Yeah, but I do feel like I don't feel like it gets in the way. I feel like I'm pretty definitive in my own vision, so I get inspired and I just get excited by seeing work. I think it's really important to be open-minded, and a lot of times when I don't like something right away, I really take a step back and think, what is it about this work that, is bothering me, and maybe I should learn from that. I recently showed some work on Lenscratch that was very traditional and very classic, beautifully done, but to be honest, the subject matter didn't appeal to me. And the work felt like from another era. Mm-hmm. And I got a number of emails that day from people saying, finally, you're showing some good work. And, I wrote back and I said, I do the best I can. I have an open mind. I try to look at everything with curiosity, and obviously they don't. But, I finally, after a few years, took comments off of Lenscratch because I really didn't need the armchair critic mm-hmm. telling me whether they approved of what I was showing or not. So, but I think it's all quite fascinating.
Yeah. I've always been really impressed with the breadth of work, of different styles that you show on Lenscratch. There are so many people in our sort of photographic artistic community, whether they're photographers or whether they're audience members or whether they're professional critics, that have these really strong opinions about, this is the only kind of work that's valid. And, not everything that you show on Lenscratch is something that I personally connect with. But the fact that that work is being made, I just think that's great. I think that the idea that we have to work in a particular way, it's just such a stifling idea,
Oh, absolutely. And I personally don't like everything I show on Lenscratch either, but I think it's important that we are exposed to the landscape that we work in, mm-hmm. that we really understand what our fellow image makers are doing. And, I don't have an MFA. I don't come out of academia. So for part of what's so great for me is that I'm curious about all of these arenas that I wasn't able to understand on my own and really look at them. And I think that these people that wrote me recently and said that I was finally showing good work, they are not also from those arenas and don't understand that this is the kind of work that's coming out of an MFA program or an art program. And, these artists are possibly, the people they don't care for are possibly really photographic artists who are using photography in a whole new way. And for me, it's just a pleasure to be able to really try to look at and understand all these different genres of work and all these different ways of making work. And I think it's going to continue to evolve. And so that's exciting.
So for the second segment, I always ask the guest to bring a topic of their own, just whatever is on their mind that they'd like to talk about. What would you like to talk about today?
Well, one thing I've been thinking about and really haven't vocalized too much is that I've been really considering the fine art photo landscape in terms of the movers and shakers that surround photographers. And in the last 2 years, I've really been noticing a real shift in who the gatekeepers are. And a shift towards so much more opportunity for women in the photo world. When I started out, most of the gatekeepers were men, most of the curators and photo center directors were men. And in about, I can't remember what year, I started writing about photographing family, and it was probably around 2008 or 9, and I was really fascinated with fathers photographing their families and wrote about it for Fraction magazine. And one day I got an email out of the blue from a photographer who had made a number of projects about family in the 1980s. And it had been totally rejected by the photo world. The curators had no interest, the galleries had no interest, the magazines had no interest. And this was very wonderful, conceptual, humorous work about motherhood that really is wonderful to look at today. And she said there were no inroads. You just could not get anything that personal published. And it gave me really pause for thought that what has shifted? Why are now we allowed to make work that's more emotional, that's about family, that's about illness, about health? And I began to think about the fact that many of the curators and festival directors and photo center directors who make the decisions about the subject matter that gets put on the wall that are women. Mm-hmm. And I think that has really shifted the photographic dialogue. And I've never heard anybody say it out loud, but it's something that I've been giving a lot of thought to. Yeah. That, we have moved away from photography as what's on the other side of the lens in terms of a landscape or a nude, and we're really making work that's internal. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big shift.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about how that shift in the sort of photographic art world, gatekeepers can have an influence on what type of work gets accepted, and then that in turn has an influence on what type of work gets made. I definitely agree that that in the past few years, certainly more and more over the past couple of years, that we've been seeing a lot more dialogue about inclusion and about about the fact that in so many arenas, not just photography or not even just the art world, but in so many arenas we see a history where women are excluded from decision making in editorial or artistic contexts. Similarly, we see the same conversation happening about people of color being excluded from the decision making, or queer people being excluded, and that conversation I feel like is really moving forward in new ways. And it's been happening in a really short amount of time that I've been seeing that conversation really changing.
Right.
Yeah. And seeing new opportunities both for artists and for curators. Things like, I know, for example, certainly you are a big a big mover and shaker these days in the photographic community. I know there are people like Hamida Glasgow at Center for Fine Art Photography. A lot of women that are doing, I mean, even stuff like Jennifer McClure, who I talked to recently, who has started up a women's photography alliance in New York.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of new opportunities for women. And I'm similarly seeing a lot of new opportunities for other more marginalized communities, like the stuff that they're doing at the Strange Fire Collective.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, I think it's really an exciting time for photography, and I think, I don't know, how much of this discussion is even important anymore, but it's just something that I have been noticing. I've also noticed how successful women have been in garnering awards and getting into exhibitions, and I'm kind of, wondering if, because of the female sensibility towards maybe perhaps a bit more drawn to the emotional side of things, is drawn to work that reflects that, and which is great.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, the only thing for me is that I do get a little wary about when people want to say that, well, look, things are better now, so we don't need to continue working on this or talking about it, because I actually think that's not really true. I think, we have made great strides at a more inclusive art world, but, for example, I just saw a thing, I think a week or two ago, there was some article that was talking about how something like 70 or 80% of solo art exhibitions are still male artists.
Oh yeah, definitely. There was a lot of press about that a couple of months ago, and if you think about it, though I just went to the Broad in Los Angeles and saw the Cindy Sherman exhibition, but walking around the rest of the museum, I would say that 80% of the artwork was all from men. And so I think it's very hard still for women to get to the upper echelons of the art world and garner the same income that male artists are receiving. So there's definitely a ways to go. But for instance, the Lenscratch Student Prize winner won for a body of work about rape and the after effects, and it's a subject that I've been really reading about and sort of learning about more and more. I saw the name of the movie just flew out of my head. It was nominated for a documentary, The Hunting Ground, and it was all about sexual assault on college campuses. And I read the John Krakauer novel, Missoula, which is all about sexual assault on campuses. And I think that the fact that people are making work that only contributes to these dialogues and this awareness of what's going on is pretty amazing and great. And so that's really exciting to me.
Yeah. I think at a time like this, it can be, in the past few weeks, there's been a lot of stuff in the news that's very disheartening. All of the things surrounding the Brock Turner case. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, this past weekend, the massacre in Orlando, that we are seeing so much pushback, so much rage against emanating from the type of people who are more used to having all of the power in the world.
Right.
And it can be very disheartening to see these the effects of that rage. But what I've been trying to think about lately, especially over the past couple of days, is how I look around, and that when we are talking about these events, that there is more awareness of what the implications of these things are, and of what kinds of misogyny or racism or homophobia or xenophobia, what all of these things, how they affect us, and people are talking about it openly. And I think, and like you say, people are making work about it. People are having these conversations, and it's out in the open, and it's part of the mainstream conversation in a way that it really has never been before. And
right.
So, yeah, I'm trying to be heartened by that. And I think that there's a lot of reason to be heartened about it.
Right. Yeah, and it's all, as I say that I feel like women are achieving more in the photo world, I also think that, we still live in a time where women suffer so greatly at the hands of just controlling, I don't know, I'm kind of getting off topic here, but...
Well, we like tangents on this show.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I think that it is kind of an interesting thought that our photo landscape and the people that are now considered gatekeepers are much more diverse than they've ever been, and that is a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting, too, talking about the concept of gatekeepers, that a lot of people will talk about how the internet has sort of leveled playing fields, and that we maybe don't have as much of a need for gatekeepers these days. But I think that statement may be overblown to some degree, particularly when we consider that that one of the things that a curator can really accomplish is a level of advocacy for communities that had been previously marginalized, and having all of these women in those curatorial roles really, like you say, I think has provided a lot of opportunities for people that might not have had the same reach that even the internet can provide these days.
Yeah, I think the internet is, I think we are the curators of the internet, and when we see things, we just move on if it's not of interest. Mm-hmm. But I still think to have someone state, this is what I think is important, or this is work that I think is really valuable to look at, still holds a lot of weight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you being on the show. I really appreciate you taking your time. Has it worked out okay for you?
Well, this is just so, this is so kind of descriptive of how generous and wonderful this community that we work in is, having met you at a portfolio review a number of years ago, and then able to see your work on sort of a yearly basis as I came back to the review each year, and get to know you more and more, and get to know your sensibilities and your thoughts, and see you evolve as an image maker, and now you putting yourself out and making time in your life to have conversations with photographers, and really, again, open up and spread the word, and do something that is generous and outside of your practice. And I think it's a perfect example of this really quite remarkable community that we work in, where so many photographers are interested in celebrating people other than themselves. And I think that I thank you for your efforts, and I think it's just I feel so lucky to be part of this community.
Yeah, I know exactly what I feel. The same gratitude all the time, and that people are I think, something like this project of mine, people have been so generous with their time to have these conversations with me. And it's really one of the high points of any week of mine when I get to have a conversation like this. And I find such value in being able to, anything that I can do to help other people out and to talk about the things that are important in our discipline, in our, and even outside of our discipline. I talk to people other than photographers as well, but that, getting to think about these things and getting to share all of these things with an audience, getting to share other people's work, it's a very rewarding experience for me, and I know you get the same thing out of all of your efforts with the various ways that you give back to the community. So definitely seeing what you've done with Lenscratch is a big part of what of the genesis of this show. People like you with Lenscratch, people like Scott Davis with the Medium Festival, seeing how we can build and how we can bring, how we can, instead of competing with each other, just bring us all up together. It's a very rewarding experience, and it's exciting to be able to be a part of that.
Yeah. And I think what we all want in life is simply to be seen, simply for someone to acknowledge that we exist. And I think that, if I can help with that and you're helping with that, and you're right, I think we are all bringing each other up. And it's mind-blowing when you go on Facebook and everyone is celebrating the achievements of other people constantly, because there are constant achievers. Mm-hmm. But in a way that feels genuine. And I've always said to people that I didn't want to go on this journey by myself. It's so much more fun to have friends and a community that is inspiring and really a very warm and giving community. So I think we're really lucky.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and I think that is probably the perfect note to end on. So thank you so much for talking with me today.
You are so welcome.
All right, and there we have it, my conversation with Aline Smithson. And, if I might just say, Aline has been just a great friend over the years, a great supporter, and I really credit her advice and support a lot for my growth as an artist personally. So just once again, thank you, Aline. You can find more of her work on her website, alinesmithson.com, which I've linked in the show notes. And as I mentioned at the top, there are still copies of the special edition of her book available, which you can order directly from her via her site. Also, she has new posts up 7 days a week at Lenscratch, and if you don't have that site bookmarked and you like photography at all I can say is you are missing out. And that is our show. If you have any questions or comments for me, you could email me at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. You can also find me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. I'd like to thank everyone who's left a rating or review on iTunes. It really means a lot to me, and it does help new listeners find the show. If you haven't done that yet, I would really appreciate it. You can also subscribe via iTunes or Stitcher or your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss any future episodes of the show. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next time, I'll be talking with photographer Ken Rosenthal, so be sure to come back in 2 weeks for that one. And as always, until then, remember, keep the channel open.